Hello, everyone, and hope you're having a good day. Welcome to my talk. I'm going to be talking to you about Blazor and Tailwind CSS, two frameworks I deeply enjoy using. So let's just get into things. So, quick intro about me. I'm a software engineer at Enable. It's going really well over there. In fact, we've actually just become a unicorn company, which is extremely exciting, and we're doing some very, very fun and interesting things in engineering. So it's a great place to be at the moment. I'm also a Microsoft MVP. I've done a lot of blogging, but as we alluded to there in the intro, I also have written a book called Blazor in Action. If that wasn't enough, I also maintain the Blazor open source library. So yeah, I don't have a huge amount of spare time, I'll admit. Anyway, that's enough about me because we're going to get into things. We've got a lot to get through today. So let's just start right at the beginning and let's talk about what is Tailwind CSS? What is it if you haven't heard about this thing before? Well, Tailwind CSS is essentially, it's a utility-based CSS framework. So what does it mean to be a utility-based CSS framework? Well, it's probably best to think of it in contrast to some other types of frameworks, to what I would consider component-based frameworks. And the obvious one to choose here is Bootstrap. So with a utility-based CSS framework, what we do is we actually use lots of small atomic style classes, and we compose those together to create the look that we want. However, if we look at more traditional component-based frameworks like Bootstrap, with those frameworks, what you do is tend to apply a specific class that has a look predefined to it. So with Bootstrap, you might have a button and you might put BTN primary on it, and that has a specific look, or BTN secondary, and that has a specific look. Those kind of predefined looks don't exist in Tailwind, okay? We just compose those as we wish on the fly. Now, this has some benefits and some trade-offs like all things. So the benefit of this is that you can have very fine-grained control over the look of your application. Everything can kind of look unique and different, and you can style things and tweak things how you like. Conversely, if you're not particularly into UI design, or you maybe don't work with the design team yourself, then this could be a bit of a challenge because you kind of don't really have anything out of the box. However, Tailwind does have a kind of component library that comes from the authors of Tailwind CSS. It is a paid-for library, but it's a good way to support the framework. If you're into that, there's also numerous open source frameworks you can use if you want something sort of have the flexibility that Tailwind offers, but you kind of want some pre-baked components. So let's look at a bit more of a concrete example of this to kind of try and hammer this home. So let's pretend we want to create this card component. Now, this is lifted straight out of Bootstrap's documentation site. So what would this look like if we were doing it with Bootstrap? Well, this is the markup that you would need to use to create that particular card. So we have the card as the overall class that we're applying to this particular piece of HTML. And then you've got the various other classes you apply along the way to get the look and feel that you want. And you can add and remove some of these. So you can have this card without the image, for example, in which case you remove the image tag, or you can have the body without a title and all this kind of thing. And you can tweak it around. But essentially what you're getting is that card. And if you want to do any like particular customizations to it, you're going to have to write some custom CSS and things like that. What would this look like, though, if we were to do it with Tailwind? So this is going to get the same effect, but this time we're using Tailwind's utility classes. And this starts to give us a feel for what it's like to work with Tailwind. So if we just work through these together, we can kind of get an idea of what's going on here. So we've got flex at the top. Now, this is saying that we want to use display flex on the overall div, at the container div there. Flex col is to do with the flex direction. So in this case, we're saying we want it to be a column layout. On the image, we've got H40, which is the height. Now, 40 itself doesn't actually map to 40 pixels or 40 rem or any of that. Actually, ties back to a number in Tailwind's configuration file, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. P4 is padding of 4, and because it's just padding of 4, it's padding all the way around. And again, that 4 maps to a number in the configuration. Text gray 800 is the color of the text, the particular shade of gray that we're going to use. And again, this is configured in the configuration file. The header there, we want that to be a bit bigger. So we've got text LG, which is text large. We have font semi-bold, MB2, which is margin bottom 2. And again, 2 maps to the configuration file. And we've got text base, which is saying for the p tag that we just want to use the base text size for that particular page. So while there's a few bits here which might look a bit odd if you've never seen Tailwind before, once you've got to grips with the basics of it, you can very quickly read the styles that are being applied to your particular UI. And this can have some really interesting productivity benefits. One of the nice things about Tailwind is because you primarily work inside of your markup, you're not really flipping back and forth between a style file and a markup file. You can do everything in your markup. So you can read through, see what's going on. If you're making changes, you can be confident they're isolated to this particular area and not have any knock-on effects. And you don't end up with these kind of ginormous sort of hundreds or thousand line long CSS files that you're trying to maintain and keep coordinated amongst many teams and all this kind of stuff. Now, I talked a bit about these numbers, H40, MB2, text gray at 100. What did and I talked about configuration files. So what does that all mean? Well, essentially, Tailwind is a big design system, okay? And this is another big benefit of Tailwind because the design system gives us constraints. And that's good because then everyone doesn't charge off doing all random stuff. If you do have a UX team, like we do at Enable, or you work with the design team where you are, they can actually codify your design system into Tailwind. And then when developers are building applications, they're kind of working within those guardrails. And it's a nice way to keep everything consistent. So just a few examples of what you can configure inside of the design system. Tailwind ships with a color palette sort of set up by default. There's, I think, around sort of 21, 22 colors in there by default. But you can change all of this, and they all come in this range of shades that you can see here. So 50 being the lightest, 900 being the darkest. So they're all there by default, but again, you can either augment them and add extra ones to them, or you can just fully replace them. It's completely up to you. Again, spacing, we talked about that H40. Well, this is what it actually maps to. So that first column there on the left-hand side, that is where that 40 number comes from. And that can map to anything inside the configuration file. So the defaults here are values in rem, and they will match over to pixels as long as you keep everything in the defaults. But you can, again, configure this however you want. Tailwind can also do more kind of interesting stuff, things which are classed as variants. So this is, say, you want to have different colors on odd and even number rows in a grid, or you want to have hover effects and things like that. Those things can all be done with Tailwind as well. And again, you can configure all of that inside Tailwind's configuration file. So as I'm kind of trying to stress the point here, all this stuff that I'm talking about is configurable. And this is an example of a bit of the configuration file. So in this case, what I'm doing here is I'm actually replacing the default color palette with these specific colors. Now, what Tailwind is going to do when this is all kind of run through Tailwind CLI, which we'll talk about in a second, is it's going to generate hundreds or thousands even of utility classes that can all use these particular colors that I'm setting up. And all that happens automatically for you. Okay, that's all taken care of. So you can kind of just add in all of the colors, all of the styles you want, all the settings you want, and Tailwind is going to take care of generating all those utility classes for you. So really what we can do here is we can kind of sum Tailwind up really, and these utility classes as Lego blocks for UI design. So much like Lego, you've got all of these various size pieces and shapes and colors and what have you, and you can compose them together however you want to create the particular design you want. And if at any point you're not happy with some of it and you want to change it, it's really easy. You can just take out the particular block that you don't like, and you can just replace it with another one, and it's all good to go. Right. So let's start bringing Blazor into the equation. Now we've kind of covered a little bit of a high level of what Tailwind is. So how would we actually get Tailwind into one of our Blazor projects? So first option here, we've got a couple of options we're going to focus on, but option one is using the Tailwind Play CDN. So what is the Tailwind Play CDN? Well, it's a really fast, quick way to get going with Tailwind. It's great if you want to try Tailwind out, but you don't want to make any big commitments yet, see how it works for you, your company, your application, things like that. So in order to get up and going with Tailwind CDN, it's as simple as adding this script tag into the head element of your page. Once you've done that, you are good to go. You can just start writing your utility classes into your markup, and Tailwind is going to take care of the rest. So in terms of how this works behind the scenes, what that little bit of JavaScript is going to do is it's going to monitor your page, and every time you're using a utility class, it's going to dynamically generate script tag and kind of write out all the classes that you're using into that script tag and into that style tag, sorry. And that's just going to keep happening over and over again. So this is a really quick way to get up and running with it. You can even use Tailwind's plugins. So Tailwind has a whole plugin system, and you can use all of the official plugins through the Tailwind CDN as well. So it's great for prototyping. It's great for trying Tailwind out. However, it is not an option for production. And that is because of kind of what I explained a second ago about how it works. It's kind of random. It's kind of dynamically generating these styles and these style tags. That's not a particularly great thing to do in a production application. So what do you do if you want to go ahead and use Tailwind in your production application? Well, that is where option 2 comes along, and that is the Tailwind CLI. And that's really what we're going to focus on for the rest of our time today. Is we're going to get into an actual application, and we're going to look at what it takes to integrate Tailwind into it. We're going to learn a bit about what it's like to work with Tailwind and actually add in some classes and style an app. And then we'll look at also how we can move this into production and publish it. So hopefully that sounds good. So that's kind of it for the slides for me. So let's jump over and have a look at the application that we're going to be working on. So let me find my Visual Studio window. There we go. So here we are. We have got a Blazor WebAssembly app, and of course we're using .NET 8 for this. So this is a standard Blazor WebAssembly app. However, it has got a few styling changes. I've been working with Blazor for a very long time now, and that sort of purple gradient on the left-hand side is kind of it's getting a little old for me. So I thought I'd try and put my own spin on this and make it a bit more interesting. Okay, but the first thing we need to do is actually get Tailwind in here so we can start using it. So how do we go about doing that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to run a command here. Now, I'm going to use npx for this, which is sort of Node.js stuff. If you're not a fan of using Node and npm and all that kind of stuff, then don't worry. Tailwind CSS actually has a standalone executable that does all of this. So if you want to stay away from Node and all that kind of stuff, you can absolutely. You can just go to the GitHub releases page and you can download the latest executable from there and run that independently. But I personally like using this. I find it the quickest and easiest way. So the command we're going to use is Tailwind CSS init, okay? And that, when we run that, is going to generate a new Tailwind configuration file. So it's tailwind.config.js file. So now we've got that. If we go back over to our application, this is what the default configuration file looks like. Okay, so we don't actually have to change anything here. If we're happy with all of the defaults that Tailwind provides, then we're good to go, apart from one thing, and that is this content array up here. So in a second, we're going to run another command for using the Tailwind CLI. And what that's going to do is invoke Tailwind's JIT compiler. So Tailwind is going to monitor our application and our usage of our utility styles, and it's going to generate an output CSS file after it's gone through this configuration system. But we just need to tell it what files to monitor for the usage of these utility classes. So that's what we're just going to pop in here. So I'm just going to add in this little bit of markup. And basically what I'm saying here is look at anything that has a .razor or a .html extension on the end of it. So that's it for the configuration file. That's all we need to do there. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a source CSS file, okay? And I'm going to just add a new folder here. I'm going to call this styles. And inside of here, I'm going to add a new item, and we're going to call this app CSS. So once that goes in there, we are going to replace what's in there with the following 3 Tailwind directives. Now, what these are going to be done, these are going to be parsed by Tailwind's JIT compiler, and on the outside, on the other side, it's going to generate a output CSS file for us that's going to have all of those hundreds of thousands of utility styles. Okay, so we don't need to worry too much more about this for now, but that's all we kind of need to do. And then the last thing I'm going to do is come over into my index.html. Excuse me a second. And I am just going to add in a link to the output CSS we're going to generate. Now, we haven't generated this yet. I'm just putting this in ahead of time for us. Okay, so I'm going to get in there. And now we can go back to the CLI and we can do what we just said, and we can actually generate that output file. So I'm going to say Tailwind CSS, and this time I'm going to say input. I'm going to pass in -i and that input file, CSS file that we just created. And then we're going to say output, the result of that, to the www root folder CSS app.css file. I'm also going to add on this -- watch on the end, okay? And that's going to tell Tailwind to keep watching those files that we specified in that content block. And every time you see a new usage, regenerate that output file. So if we execute that command, then we've now got that running. If we go back to Visual Studio, we can now see that we've got a CSS file here, and we've got our, we've got that being generated there, and our output CSS file. So if I come back and we can just have a quick look at that, and you can see this is what's been generated by the JIT compiler from Tailwind, okay? So all that just from those 3 little directives that we added in. Right, so now it's time to actually have a look and see what our application looks like. So I'm just going to run a command to get things going, and then we'll be able to see what we've got. Just letting that spin up now, and then there we go. Oh, here we go. So this is our application up and running. So you can see it looks a little bit different to what we had before with the standard template. Hopefully looks a little bit more interesting. However, there's quite a few bits here that aren't completed, okay? So nothing here looks particularly interesting. It's all text. However, some of this, it should be headings and things like that. We've got this big old area on the right that, again, doesn't look particularly interesting. We could do with sprucing that up a bit. So we're going to work through a few scenarios together so we can get a feel of what it's like to use Tailwind as a developer. So if we go back over to Visual Studio now, let's start with something fairly basic. So let's look at how we can just do some standard styling. So I'm going to open up the index page and just get rid of these other ones for now. And what we can see here is we've got this H1 tag, but it's not got anything applied to it. As we saw a second ago, it doesn't have any unique styling. It doesn't really stand out on the page. So we want that to be a little bit more interesting. So let's put some styles on here. So we can say we want the font, for example, to be extra bold because we want that to be big and bright. And we want to be much bigger. So we're going to say, text of 7XL. Now, if we save that and go back over to our application, you can see that now we've got something that looks much more like a heading, okay? Much more bigger, much more catching your eye. But let's add a little bit of space underneath because that welcome to your new app is looking a little bit close there. So what we can do here is say add like a margin bottom of 6. So if we do that and go back over to our app, you can see that we've got a bit of spacing in there. So pretty quickly, we've been able to make this look like a heading. We've not had to write any CSS, of course, to do this. We've just been adding in those nice compact utility styles. So that's great. So let's turn our attention to that P tag next, and kind of we can do the similar thing. So on here, we can make it slightly larger, and we want to have a bigger margin at the bottom here. So we say a margin bottom of 20 on that one. So if we go back over, now we've got slightly bigger text, and we've got a much bigger gap between that paragraph tag and the next bit of markup underneath it. Okay, so hopefully you can see it's fairly straightforward adding these things in, and especially with hot reload, it is a fast sort of cycle of iteration that you can go through. Okay. Now let's do something a little bit more interesting. That panel on the right-hand side we were looking at, I called out a second ago, it's looking rather bland, but we want that to kind of pop off the page a bit. So let's add a nice background gradient, okay, to that to make it look a little bit more interesting. Now, gradients are always one of those things that I find quite tricky. I've been writing CSS for a long time, but it's always one of those syntaxes I end up having to Google and things like that. So how can we do that with Tailwind? Well, what I'm going to do is come over and just add in 3 new classes onto this div. Now, the 3 that we're going to add is BG gradient to bottom right. Now, this tells Tailwind that we want to do a background gradient and we want it to go to the bottom right, and it's going to start in the top left by default. We're going to say we want it to start from green 400 and we want it to go to blue 500. Okay, so those three classes are all we've added in. So if we save that and jump back over, we have now got a gradient added to our site. Looks a little bit more interesting than it did before, and it was just 3 utility classes in order to do that. And the great thing is we want to kind of make that even more interesting. We can even do a hover effect on it. So I've added another couple of classes in here. So I'm saying when we hover, so I'll put that hover colon in front of the class, apply the from blue 500 and to green 400. So essentially reverse things around. So I save that and then we go back to our app. Now, when I hover over it, those styles, those colors are now being reversed. So, and again, it's pretty trivial. So 5 classes in total, and we've been able to get a gradient, and we even got that nice kind of fancy hover effect going on as well. So let's do something a little bit more interesting again and add some transforms in. So over here, we've got this survey prompt thing, but it doesn't look very interesting at the moment. So we're going to add some base styles to that first of all. So I'm going to open up the survey prompt component. I'm just going to replace what's there by default with some pre-made styles I've already done. There we go. So it looks a little bit more like a survey prompt now. It's kind of sticks out a bit more. But I want this to kind of look a little bit more like it's sort of been plastered on the page, more like a banner, okay? So let's see if we can skew it a bit and twist the element on the page. How would we do that with Tailwind? So we go back over here, we can add in another couple of classes. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say I want to transform this element and I want to rotate it by 3. Now, 3 is an arbitrary number that maps back to that configuration file we talked about earlier. And you might notice I've got a minus in front of that. And that means I want it to go counterclockwise because by default, it would go clockwise. So if we add those in and jump back over to our app, you can see there now we've been able to skew that element and twist it around. And there's lots of stuff we can do with this. And we'll look at a little bit more of an advanced usage of some of this stuff in a second. But hopefully this is kind of giving you a little bit of a feel for what it's like to work with Tailwind and to do some sort of relatively basic styling and manipulation of elements. So let's kind of address one of the main concerns that I often get from people when I first talk to them about Tailwind. So one of the things you see often online is reusability and duplicating code and things like this. Most people look at this and sort of say, oh, it reminds them very much of using inline styles, okay? And they're kind of right. It kind of does have that feel to it to some degree. But there are sort of 2 mechanisms we can use to remove any redundancy, any duplication and things like that. So the first one I'm going to talk to you about is using some functionality in Tailwind itself. And it's using that source CSS file that we actually used earlier. Now, this is a great technique for things like styling things like H1 tags, paragraph tags, anchor tags, things like that. Things that are kind of things you want to style once and then you want them to be the same across your entire application. Because right now, if we want to have another H1 with this same style, we'd have to copy these same style classes across. In fact, if we go back to our application and we go on the other pages, you can see that their headings don't actually have this style applied to them at all. Okay, so let's see what we can do here. So if we open up our in our source CSS file here, we can pop in a couple of bits of code. So the first one I'm going to pop in is, hold on, let me find my snippet, is this one. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying for all H1s on my application, I want you to apply the following utility classes to it. So that apply directive is part of Tailwind. And this is the nice thing about Tailwind's CLI, is because it's running through this and it's doing some JIT compilation essentially for this, we can kind of set all this stuff in. We can use those utility classes even in our CSS file. and Tailwind's going to take care of making sure that works out in the outputted result, the resultant CSS file that it creates. So if I do that and I save the application and I come back over and we go across the site now, you can now see that the counter page and the fetch data page have now got styling on their H1 tags, and that's coming now because we've done it in that source file. Now it's a global style applied to that. So we can happily now go back to our index page and we can remove all of this from our H1 tag. And we'll even do the same thing for our paragraph tag as well. So we'll get rid of that off of there. We'll save that. We'll go back to our source file. And again, what we'll do here is we'll add in the same thing, but for a paragraph tag. So if we save that, go back to our app, and we can go through here, and everything is basically almost still the same. Just reload that. There you go. Still the same as it was before, except now we've got that paragraph styling across all of the pages of our app. So that's one way we can deal with reusable and repeating styles in our application for kind of base level elements that we're using in our markup. Now, there's another scenario. What about more complex logic? Okay, well, more complex markup rather. So this Tailwind panel that we've got on the right-hand side here with our gradient, that's actually, again, mirrored on every single page. But we can't kind of, we could, move all of the styling and nest in various classes and everything into that source file. But that's not really a great option. This is where we can lean on Blazor and Blazor's component model to solve this particular problem. So over here, what we can do instead is create a new component. So I can say over here, I can say a new component. I'm just going to call this Tailwind for now. There we go. And once I've got that Tailwind component, I'm just going to add in all of the same markup that exists that we were using a second ago on the index page. Okay, save that off, and then I can go over and I'm just going to check my application is being rebuilt correctly. And now we've got that there. I'm going to go over to the index. I can just get rid of all of this markup here. So I can get rid of that, and I can now say, use my Tailwind component instead. Don't use that markup. And once I've got that, I can go over to the counter page. I can replace it over here. And I can go to the fetch data page. If we scroll down, here's the same markup, and we'll replace that there as well. So if we save all that off, and we'll go back over to our app, and you can see that we've still got the same style over here on the right-hand side, but if we go across our pages, we now have that. And the nice thing about this is we've got this all now centralized in a single component. We're sharing that across our application. If we want to make changes to this, we decide we want to change the different, we want to change the gradient or something like that, we can do it in one place and it's going to be reflected across our app. So hopefully you can see by using Tailwind, you're not giving up sort of any of that ability to reuse things. You're going to end up with a maintenance nightmare long term with all of these kind of repeated styles. You can still centralize things, and those two techniques should work pretty well for you. Right. Let's move on to almost the last thing now, something a little bit more interesting. So on this homepage, let's try and do something a little bit more fancy. So let's try and animate this component on the right. So I have this Tailwind sort of panel slide in from the right-hand side. How can we do something more advanced like that? Well, we're going to build that component right now. We're going to do that. We're not going to use any JavaScript to do that either. This is just going to be Blazor and Tailwind working together to create that effect for us. So let's go over and we're going to start off by creating a new component here. And we're going to call this one imaginatively slide in. Okay, and that's going to be our sliding component. And again, you could kind of use this as a base to do more fancy things. But let's add in some initial code. So this particular component is going to be using sort of the templated component approach that we have in Blazor. And what that means is it's going to wrap some existing content and manipulate it. So we're going to capture whatever content we wrap in this child content parameter here, and then we're going to output it in between this div that we've made. So that's going to allow us to manipulate it. And we're going to apply different style classes to that div, and that's what's going to create this animation effect for us. So let's add in the base styles for the div. So what we're going to say here is we want this div to take up the full height of the parent, which is h full. And then we're going to say we want it to transition any changes to CSS properties, and we want that to be over a duration of 500 milliseconds. And we're also adding that transforming that we used earlier to skew that element earlier on. And that's going to so that we can maneuver this on the page and create the animation effect. And then finally, we're going to output whatever the current value is of this animation styles field that we have here defined on the component. Now, at the moment, we haven't got anything in here. So let's add in some default styles for that. Now, there's some very important bits that we need to understand when we come into this, and I'll kind of call them out as we go. But for now, we just need to understand that we're going to use translate X full to move this particular content its full width to the right, okay? So in our case, it's going to push that panel off the right-hand side of the screen. And we're also going to lower its opacity to 0, okay? So it's not going to stop it taking up space on the page. It's just going to make it transparent for us. So that's going to be the two initial things. That's going to be how it's going to start when the component first renders. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add in this trigger animation method. Okay, and we're going to call this in a second. And what that's going to do is that's going to create the animation effect. So we're going to update the animation styles field with two new values. And we're going to say translate X0 and opacity 100. Now, this is the important thing to understand at this point. Translate X full, translate X0, they're manipulating the same CSS property. And this is how this all works. This is the magic under the hood. So transition and duration 500 is going to transition any change to a CSS property over a duration of 500 milliseconds. So when we translate from X full to X0, that will happen over 500 milliseconds, and that is where our animation effect is going to go from. And then opacity 100 is going to go to 100 from 0, so it's going to kind of fade in a little bit as well, which will just make it look a little bit slicker. Now we're going to call this trigger animation from our own code. Actually, we're going to call it from a lifecycle method, but I'll explain that in a second. But we need to call status changed here, okay, to create a manual refresh in Blazor. Now, we're going to glue this all together with an on after render call. So once this component renders, and we want it to render first because we want it to render off the page and be invisible. So if it's the first render of this component, we're just going to wait 300 milliseconds, make sure everything's there and present, and then what have you. And then we're going to call that trigger animation method that we just talked about, okay, down here. Now, anything that's in on after render doesn't actually doesn't automatically trigger Blazor to do a re-render by default, because you can end up in loops and things like that. So that's why we're manually calling it here. And we know we won't end up in a loop because we have this first render check on there as well. So this is kind of all we need really at this point. This is our kind of finished component. So if we go back over to our index page now, we can actually wrap our Tailwind component in this sliding component like so. So we can pop that around there, pop that in there. And then if we save that and go back over to our app, we can see if this is kicked in. And there we go. We've now got our component sliding in from the side. So that was a very quick example of how we could do animations. Very, very quickly, because I think I'm at time, I'm just do 30 more seconds of how we would actually take this to production. So we've got all this going. We've got our CLI kicking on. How would we actually do this if we were going to go production if we had a CI pipeline? Well, we could put a script in there and run the Tailwind CLI from there. But another option that you have is actually to use the CS proj file and some targets in there. So we can actually add in a few targets. And by doing that, we can actually trigger the Tailwind CLI automatically from our build pipeline. So what will happen here is when we're in release mode, we can actually do a build of our application. And that's going to trigger that npx command for us in the Tailwind CLI. And then that's going to output the file, that output CSS file for us automatically, all as part of our build pipeline without us having to write any extra scripts. If we quickly look at that output CSS file, you can now see that we have an output CSS file that's also been minimized for us as well. Whew, right, sorry, that was a whistle.
No, that was great. That was fantastic. So much amazing information packed into this talk. Greatly appreciated, Chris. We do have some questions. I'm going to rapid fire through these.
Yeah.
You had touched on this earlier specifically, so I don't know if you just want to reiterate that, but someone said, Tailwind is inline CSS. Change my mind.
Yeah, I spent like 5 minutes hopefully debunking that myth.
Right.
So it's definitely not. It looks very similar and things like that. But as I showed, you can either use Blazor's component model, or you can use the apply directive in that source CSS file, and you can get away from all the horribleness of inline styles.
Right, absolutely. And then there was just another kind of someone expressing their frustration for Tailwind, which is a valid opinion. People like it, people love it, people don't like it. Just like anything else, it's a tool you can choose.
People love and hate Bootstrap. Like it's
right, yeah,
and like programmers have been fighting over programming languages since the dawn of time. So you're never going to keep everyone happy, and this is just another tool in the tool belt. I don't always use Tailwind.
Yeah,
like everything, it's using the right tool at the right time.
Absolutely. And then another opinion here, Tailwind is pretty and it's, great visual design, but they're expressing their concern for like how tedious it is because there's lots of little classes and there's certainly a learning curve, but that's CSS in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I'd say is it's probably quicker to learn Tailwind's naming convention than it is to learn every single CSS property there is, especially like because they're churning out new stuff all the time. So I find it's one of those things. Yeah, you're gonna have to put a bit of effort in the first time, like like everything. There's always a bit of initial learning curve, but it starts to make sense pretty quickly. I think anyway, and certainly I've used this with multiple teams across multiple companies, and kind of they've all picked it up pretty quickly. So I don't think that one's too much of a concern if you dedicate a bit of time to it.
Absolutely. And then there was a question from Dan saying, can they use Tailwind just to use that @apply syntax?
Yeah, I've had people ask this, but yeah, I mean, you can do, yeah, absolutely. What I'd say is I think you lose the productivity side of Tailwind. The writing the styles directly into the markup is where you save a lot of time. Being able to see at a glance what's being applied where in your markup and understand that has a lot of clarity. I mean, I've worked on some big applications that have got thousands of lines of CSS, and when you're trying to find things and what applies to what and what's affecting this and what could be the effect of changing this thing and that thing, that's where all the maintenance burden comes in sort of bigger apps. And that's kind of, if you keep using the apply directive, you can end up in the same situation. You don't kind of mitigate the problem.
It's like that that one GIF comes to mind with CSS and like the blinds and like you're just tweaking it.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, definitely.
A question from Rob on YouTube. This is just more holistically about Blazor. So can Blazor do inline code like JSX and TSX? Yeah.
Oh, interesting. So I guess so. I mean, like you could do, so for example, when you're like, if we, I don't think my screen's being shared anymore, but for example, on like the counter page that's in the default template.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got this on-click event happening here, and what we're saying is call this method, and that method's defined in the code block, and it's doing current count plus plus. We could equally just sort of do an inline lambda here and do exactly the same thing, can't spell obviously, but you just do current count plus plus like that. So you can have it in line like that if you want to. I think the only thing I find is that that's fine for small things, but I think once you get a bigger component that's got a bit more to it, it can get quite difficult to kind of keep track of things. So sometimes it's nice to have sort of logic down at the bottom, markup at the top. But again, it's situation dependent and personal preference. You might prefer to do that everywhere, in which case, cool, you have at it. Whatever makes you happy.
Awesome. And do you like snow? That's just a random question out there that Cam queued up.
So I queued that one up just to humor and acknowledge the conversation that has been going on over in Twitch.
Oh, okay. I'm not privy to that conversation. So are we talking snow as in like Christmas?
As in snow,
like the weather,
like frozen precipitation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm one of those where I much prefer winter to summer. Like I love winter. I love
me
snow
too.
and ice and all that. It's brilliant. So I'm a big fan of snow in that case.
Awesome. And then finally, Ed, our good friend Ed Charbonneau, his opinion on TSS is if you're going to learn about Tailwind, go with Chris. So awesome.